Welcome to the Change Advisory Board, aka the Cab Call. This podcast is brought to you by Nicholas King and Columbia Cloudworks. Today we are embarking on a deep dive into, well, one of the most agonizing ethical dilemmas you can imagine.
It really is.
We're talking about what happens when institutional loyalty, the bonds that hold our groups together, whether it's an ancient fraternity, a local community, even professional services, what happens when that clashes, just violently, with personal moral duty?
Right.
We've stacked up an incredibly compelling set of sources here. They range from centuries-old fraternal oaths, the devastating history of institutional secrecy, all the way to modern socio-political analysis of trauma and community dynamics.
And we're going to be looking specifically at the tragedy in Uvalde and some really revealing clinical studies on moral injury in law enforcement.
So this isn't just a history lesson.
No, absolutely not. Our mission today is not just to summarize reports or, recount history. We are really trying to wrestle with these fundamental dilemmas of accountability.
That tension between the group and the individual.
Exactly. The collective good versus the individual conscience. We're asking, how do these tightly bound groups, sworn brotherhoods, or even, tight-knit rural towns, how do they respond when their core identity is just violently threatened?
Threatened either by a failure from within or, just as often, intense judgment from the outside.
Yeah, that's key. We have to look at those moments when the duty to your own cohort, it either shifts or maybe it just collapses into a moral failure to the wider community.
Yeah.
Or even a failure to the truth itself.
And the sources we have give us a framework for this, right?
They do. A necessary one, though, I have to say. It's often a pretty dark framework. We're talking about cautionary tales like the Morgan Affair, Licio Gelli's P2 Lodge.
Infamous examples.
And then, as you said, the deep, unsettling paradox of the Uvalde elections and the psychological weight of moral injury detailed by law enforcement officers themselves. All of this helps us navigate this gray area where good intentions can meet systemic collapse.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with the fundamental idea of group obligation. Set the absolute baseline for commitment.
Agreed.
And we see this so clearly in the fraternal context with what the sources call the hand-to-back principle. It cites the Master Masons. Well, extraordinary commitment to fly to a brother's relief, even at the risk of your own life.
It's an incredible standard. But, and this is crucial, the source material immediately inserts a necessary clause, a rational caveat.
Right, it stops it from just becoming blind self-destruction.
That boundary is what makes the duty functional rather than just, rhetorical. This extreme intervention, this relief, should only be undertaken if there's a greater probability of saving his life than losing my own.
So it's an ideal of profound support, but it's conditional.
It demands a calculated rationality. It's not a blank check written on your own mortality. It can't be.
So when a brother signals real distress, and this can be symbolized by the grand hailing sign or the specific words, "Oh Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" the oath demands an immediate and profound response.
The whole strength of the brotherhood is defined by that willingness to intervene.
But only if the act isn't futile or suicidal for the person trying to help.
And that rationality is so key because the duty itself, while it defines the brotherhood, it simultaneously creates an inherent ethical tension.
How so?
Well, the very nature of being obligated to protect and support your brother in almost all circumstances, it implicitly establishes a default state of concealment.
Ah, so you're bound to shield the brother, which means you are, by default, bound to keep his secrets.
Or shield him from outside judgment.
Yeah, and that's where the moral limitations become obvious. The ritual itself knows this is a danger because it offers a clear, but an absolutely terrifying exception clause.
The famous exception. Murder and treason excepted.
Just 3 words.
Think about the weight of those 3 words. They are a quiet admission that the fraternal bond is so powerful that unless you're dealing with these 2 capital crimes, the expectation is to cover, to conceal, to shield.
That exception clause is a moral stop sign.
It is. It's signaling that only in the face of the most heinous crimes against humanity and the state murder and treason does that fraternal obligation possibly break.
And even then,
as history shows, internal politics often tries to ignore the exception.
this brings us directly to a key question from you, the listener. What should you do when you learn of a brother's unbecoming conduct, especially if they haven't explicitly asked for help?
Right.
When does intervention shift from being a passive rescue to an active correction?
Hmm.
When does it become a brother's proactive business? It seems the duty goes way beyond just waiting for a distress signal.
It does, and this is absolutely critical to understanding institutional integrity. The duty is not just reactive, it's profoundly proactive.
What do the sources say?
They lay out a specific ethical mandate for Master Masons. Their role isn't just protector, but moral custodian, a guide within the organization. They are authorized, in fact, they are required, to correct the errors and irregularities of your uninformed brethren and to guard them against a breach of fidelity.
Guard them against a breach of fidelity. That sounds like a mandate for constant moral maintenance.
It is, precisely. This means the expectation is that the internal mechanisms of the Brotherhood are self-regulating. The responsibility rests with the Master Mason to proactively engage with the moral irregularities of their peers.
So you don't wait for the crisis.
You can't. You can't wait for a brother to spiral into a crisis or worse, commit one of those accepted crimes. You have to intervene when the misconduct is just unbecoming or an irregularity.
And if you don't?
If you fail to do so, you are passively allowing the moral erosion of the entire structure.
And if they don't engage, if the choice is silence, turning a blind eye, the consequences, according to our sources, are institutional decay. It's what the text refers to conceptually as untempered mortar.
Yeah. And this is where this ancient fraternal structure finds a really disturbing modern parallel in the analysis of law enforcement culture. The comparison is chilling because the dynamics are identical. Peer loyalty, institutional pressure. The studies on moral injury among law enforcement officers, or LEOs, they provide devastating clarity on what happens with silence and betrayal inside that professional brotherhood.
Blue structure.
Exactly. And what's absolutely crucial here is what the studies reveal about the internal context. When fellow officers correct morally dubious behavior, it's not a negative thing. It's a contextual factor that positively reduces moral stress.
It actually discourages misconduct.
Actively discourages it. So intervention isn't just a moral corrective for one person. It acts as a stress release valve for the entire system. It prevents moral injury from taking root.
And the reverse must be true.
It is. When an LEO sees something morally dubious and another officer steps in and says, hey, that's not how we do things, it affirms the moral structure of the profession. It provides validation. It stops the individual from entering a state of, dissonance.
But the failure to intervene, the silence or the cover-up,
That is what actively contributes to institutional decay.
this makes me think of the concepts of just ad bellum and jus in bello. They're terms from military ethics, but they seem to apply here.
They really do. Jus ad bellum is about the just cause for a conflict for law enforcement. That's the justified mission of keeping public safety.
But the real pain, the moral injury, it comes from jus in bello, the just conduct during the fight.
Yes, an officer suffering moral injury often feels they failed jus in bello, not because they used unjust force, but because the institution itself violated its own moral contracts.
So if they witness misconduct and stay silent,
They violate their own jus in bello, their just conduct toward their oath and their community. And the failure of a peer to correct that behavior, that itself becomes a potentially morally injurious event, a PMIE.
let's define TMIEs clearly. Potentially morally injurious events. What are some common examples of how institutional failure turns into a PMIE for an officer on the street?
Well, PMIEs are actions or inactions that violate your deeply held moral code. In Leo culture, they're moral. They're multifaceted.
Yeah.
It could be witnessing excessive force by a colleague, a direct moral violation.
But you're saying it's often more subtle than that.
Much more often, yes. It involves betrayal events committed by organizational leadership.
Yeah.
We're talking about administrative cover-ups, management refusing to back officers who acted correctly but were, politically inconvenient.
Or the courts failing to prosecute obvious crimes.
That's a huge one. Or institutional pressure to falsify reports to protect the department's image.
So the officer is trapped, caught between their duty to the public and a coerced duty to the institution's survival.
Precisely. And if the peers stay silent during this crisis, if that hand-to-back principle gets inverted to mean hand-to-back to hold the line of concealment, the moral injury just compounds.
There's that devastating quote from one Leo in the sources.
I know the one you mean. He observed the culture of silence and corruption and said, "Nobody was doing it. I feel like we were all just doing sin together and enjoying it."
That quote is just. It's profoundly disturbing. It shows how misconduct gets normalized.
Yes, the officer only recognized the sin in hindsight. In the moment, silence created a shared moral vacuum where all the professional standards just vanished.
And that shared silence becomes the untempered mortar.
Exactly. If intervention reduces moral stress and discourages misconduct, then the failure to intervene actively contributes to institutional decay. We see this acutely in the experience of a neo named Charles in the studies.
Ray, he detailed multiple PMIEs that he committed himself, plus the constant exposure to trauma and these increasing betrayal events from leadership.
Charles's account is a perfect illustration of how individual moral erosion is often systemic. The pressure of constant trauma, combined with the betrayal from the institutional structure administrators, courts, peers, it just necessitates integrity and correction from within.
If the moral compass of the peer group is shattered, silence doesn't just neglect the victim.
It actively degrades the moral health of the officer and encourages the continued corrosion of the organization itself. It's a vicious cycle. The officer who stays silent to protect his career or his colleague eventually becomes morally injured by that very act of silence.
So the system designed to enforce justice becomes a source of profound moral betrayal for the people inside it.
And that demonstrates, pretty conclusively, that the failure to intervene, that choice of silence, is truly the untempered mortar that leads to structural collapse. Doesn't matter if that structure is an ancient fraternity or a modern police department.
So if that's the institutional requirement to intervene, let's explore the human limits of that. It's a perfect transition to defining the conceptual boundaries of this duty, which brings us to one of the most evocative terms from the sources, the cable tow. The cable tow is defined in the source text as the rope that symbolically binds masons. It's such a powerful metaphor for connection and mutual obligation.
It is. And that symbolic binding, it implies an obligation that's meant to be extreme, a commitment that knows very few bounds. But what's fascinating, and frankly terrifying, is how this symbol can be violently inverted in a corrupt structure.
What do you mean by inverted?
When the institution's primary function shifts from promoting morality to enforcing secrecy or corruption, the cable tow gets, well, it gets repurposed.
We see this play out in history, don't we? It creates some of the biggest political and social crises of their time. The sources point to two big examples, the Morgan Affair and Licio Gelli's P2 Lodge.
Right. And these historical markers, they give real teeth to that metaphor of the cable tow becoming a noose for the truth. Let's just take the Morgan Affair in the 1820s.
This was William Morgan, a New Yorker who was going to publish a book exposing Masonic secrets.
Exactly. He wanted to reveal what he saw as abuses in the organization. The reaction wasn't dialogue. It wasn't internal correction. It was ruthless, absolute concealment.
And the consequence of that organizational impulse.
Morgan disappeared, presumed murdered, most likely by men who were bound by the very oath he was trying to expose. But the key takeaway wasn't just the murder itself, it was the profound institutional response. Mass cover-up, legal obstruction, and an organization that seemed to prioritize protecting its secrets and its members, even the killers, over fundamental justice.
The fallout was huge.
It was catastrophic. It triggered the rise of the anti-Masonic political party in the United States. It showed that one organization's attempt at collective concealment can escalate into a nationwide political crisis.
And then decades later, we see the same weaponized loyalty with the P2 Lodge in Italy.
Propaganda do, led by Licio Gelli. He took this concept of fraternal loyalty and just twisted it into an apparatus of political subversion. P2 wasn't a social club. It was a clandestine, incredibly powerful group that subverted Italian state institutions, banking, military, media, politics, all for its own ends.
And when it was exposed in the 1980s,
the list of members read like a who's who of the Italian deep state, involved in mass corruption, even major terrorist events.
So in both cases, Morgan and Gelli the cable tow, the instrument designed to hold the community together for good was instead twisted to enforce silence and corruption.
It becomes a tool of organized crime and political subversion, a noose for the truth. It represents the complete moral failure of the system. The original intent is unity and mutual support, but when it's used to protect killers or corrupt figures, it's the ultimate betrayal of its own founding principles.
So in the context of these obligations, we have to circle back to that listener question, the more conceptual one. What is the average length of a person's cable tow? Not literally, of course, but it forces us to discuss the limits of moral obligation. Where does an individual draw the line on self-sacrifice?
Well, we already have that line established right there in the oath, that self-preservation clause we talked about. The duty to fly to a brother's relief, should only be undertaken if there is a greater probability of saving his life than losing my own.
That phrase is just. It's such a profound instance of cold, hard rationality embedded inside a spiritual oath.
It is. It acknowledges the natural instinct for self-preservation, and it provides an ethical off-ramp.
A very clear, hard boundary.
Exactly. The commitment is extreme, but it is not suicidal, and it is not intended to be politically or morally blinding. It confirms that the preservation of life, including your own, takes precedence over a potentially futile act of rescue. If you rush in knowing you will die, you're violating that rational boundary. The cable tow, conceptually, it only stretches so far before the obligation has to yield to reason.
Okay, but even with that rational boundary set, we still have to grapple with the fact that people judge differently. Some people can tolerate behavior that others cannot. If the institution requires moral correction, but its members have these vastly different internal moral tolerance meters, how do you reconcile that?
This is where the organization demands a deep measure of intellectual humility and charity. And this is guided by philosophical sources like Albert Pike's texts. His argument is against immediate, harsh, or self-righteous judgment.
Right.
We're constantly reminded that we know but little of the real merits or demerits of any fellow creature.
The classic philosophical argument. You can't judge another man until you've walked in his shoes. Or, I guess, stood on his slippery crag.
That's the metaphor Pike uses, yes. Profound empathy is encouraged by suggesting that nearly everyone has stood upon the slippery crags that overhung the abyss of guilt. It's an ask to acknowledge our own human frailty.
It's that unsettling idea that any one of us is just. One urgent temptation, one moment of great financial need, or simply a little more wine away from committing a terrible crime.
Absolutely. Pike asks the reader to look back at their own close calls and shudder, acknowledging that if temptation had been a little more urgent or a little longer continued, we might have fallen never to rise again.
And that perspective necessitates tempering judgment.
Because we can rarely say with certainty that this man is more guilty than that. We just don't have the context of their internal struggle, their desperation, their own betrayal events.
But I have to challenge that a little bit. Doesn't that argument that we're all fallible, we're all near the abyss, doesn't that become the ultimate institutional excuse for inaction?
That's a critical challenge.
I mean, if everyone is deemed fallible, how do you ever enforce accountability without instantly being called a hypocrite?
Well, Pike's point isn't about excusing this conduct. It's about how we approach moral correction. It links back to that proactive duty we discussed earlier. Accountability based on pure, objective law often lacks the perspective of human context.
Okay.
Masonry demands faith, hope, and loving kindness. Charity for our fellows in conjunction with accountability, not as a replacement for it. The charity is there to ensure the correction is aimed at rehabilitation and restoration, not just retribution.
So it's about elevating people, not just punishing them.
Yes. The structure knows its laws cannot wholly change men's natures, so its focus must be on elevating them, finding those latent good traits, providing support, rather than just immediately imposing the most severe punishment. That tempering of judgment is the prerequisite for effective, non-hypocritical enforcement.
That sets up a perfect pivot point. If internal fidelity requires this delicate balance of stern accountability and deep charity, what happens when the entire institution has to choose between loyalty to itself and loyalty to the state?
The macro scale.
Let's shift our focus there, raising the dramatic question of revolution versus treason.
Okay.
Our sources highlight that several key American founding fathers, Washington, Franklin, Paul Revere, were Freemasons. The establishment of the United States was, by definition, an act of treason against Great Britain. They discarded loyalty to the crown for loyalty to an ideal.
It was a collective moral and political shift. Allegiance was fundamentally transferred. And Paul Revere, who famously used the infrastructure of these fraternal organizations to spread intelligence during the war, he saw Freemasonry as a path to self-improvement and social advancement.
And that reflects a much older tradition, right, going back to the guilds.
Exactly. The sources connect this back to the 14th century operative Masons in documents like the Regius Poem. These texts establish specific rights for the workmen: the right to voluntary association, fair wages, speech, assembly, and most importantly, the right to self-determination.
So the American Revolution, led in part by men steeped in these principles, can be seen as the ultimate assertion of that older right to self-determination against a state they saw as tyrannical.
It is. And this historical context sets up the perfect paradox of what makes a rebellion justified.
So we have to contrast the Founders' Revolution, a treason committed in the name of liberty, with the treason implied in the P2 Lodge, where the cable tow became that noose for the truth.
The contrast is stark. P2 was about corruption and subversion of established systems for self-gain. The American Revolution, conversely, claimed a higher moral ground, the creation of a system dedicated to liberty and constitutional governance.
But the question remains, and it's an agonizing one for anyone thinking about civil disobedience or rebellion. If the violent means treason, armed conflict, were justified by the ends in 1776, how can any of us ever really know if our cause is truly just when we decide to dismantle an existing political order?
Right. When does revolutionary self-determination cross that line into self-serving corruption, like P2?
Where's the line?
I think the answer lies in the post-conflict commitment to civil order and the immediate repudiation of the violent means you used. We find profound guidance here in the actions of George Washington. He understood the moral danger of a revolutionary military holding on to power.
He could have become a dictator.
Easily. After the war, Congress gave him immense authority. He could have established a military government. Instead, he made a solemn public declaration. He said that the sword, which was the last resort for the preservation of our liberties, ought to be the first thing laid aside when those liberties are firmly established.
That transition is absolutely critical. It implies that the violent means must immediately yield to civil obligation and establish law once the goal is achieved.
Yes, true justice is established through the structured rule of law, not maintained indefinitely by the sword of the righteous. And this is how we can differentiate justifiable revolution from self-serving criminality. Revolution, if it's just, seeks to replace a tyrannical order with a civil, constitutional one. Corruption, like P2, just seeks to destroy the existing civil order to enrich a select few.
And this forces that direct discussion of duty to self versus duty to the state. On one hand, you have the inherent right to self-determination. On the other, you have the modern professional's oath, like a military officer's, requiring unflinching commitment to the nation, service before self, even risking your life.
That military oath represents the ultimate submission of the individual will to the national collective. Your life is subservient to the state's security.
But the American system was designed to reconcile these opposing duties.
It was. It did this by institutionalizing the rights from those older fraternal principles: speech, assembly, due process guaranteeing them in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
So the military officer's oath isn't just to defend the land, but to uphold the document that guarantees the very liberties the founders fought to establish.
Exactly. Their sacrifice is for the principle of the state, ensuring the system itself guarantees civil liberties. The whole structure is an attempt to distinguish justifiable rebellion from self-serving corruption by making the rights, not the rulers, sovereign.
We've established the deep commitment of an oath and the agonizing calculus needed to know when that oath must be broken for a higher cause. Now we have to transition from that historical and philosophical high ground to a contemporary, painful low point. A spectacular institutional collapse.
Uvalde.
The aftermath of the Robb Elementary shooting in Uvalde, Texas. The aftermath exposed these profound, publicly documented failures in crisis management. We have reports of officers delaying entry, the 77-minute wait, the tragic detail of an officer aiming a rifle but holding fire while awaiting permission.
The public discourse painted local officials and law enforcement as having utterly failed their core duty to intervene. A classic institutional collapse.
The failure was widely documented. The accountability, based on any external rational standard, seemed clear-cut. And yet, here's the deep and unsettling paradox we have to analyze. Despite all that criticism, the community of Uvalde re-elected many of those same officials.
The most poignant example is Cody Smith winning the mayor's race over Kimberly Monterrubio, a victim's mother running explicitly on a platform of accountability.
It seems to defy common sense. It seems to defy basic justice. How does a community justify prioritizing group cohesion over accountability in the face of such profound documented failure?
This is where we have to bring in the sociological and psychological analysis, specifically a concept known as identity protective cognition.
Okay, let's unpack that term, identity protective cognition.
It's a powerful psychological justification mechanism. Scholars like Dan Kahan have written about it. It suggests that when facts or accountability threaten the integrity or the positive image of a highly cohesive group, in this case, the Uvalde community and its institutions' people, adopt a defensive posture.
They circle the wagons.
They collectively begin circling the wagons.
Yeah.
And this behavior is rooted in the powerful, often unconscious need to protect the group's shared identity when it's faced with an existential threat or critically with intense outsider judgment.
So the scrutiny from national news, from federal investigators, from political activists, the very people demanding accountability. Instead of forcing an honest reckoning, it actually triggered this defensive mechanism and backfired.
Absolutely. For many Uvalde residents, the national media storm was perceived not as a search for truth or justice, but as a hostile intrusion, a victimization imposed by external judgmental forces that don't understand their life. The identity of their community was under attack.
So the re-election of officials becomes a way of pushing back.
In that light, yes, the re-election is interpreted by many residents as the community collectively standing up to this external judgment. They prioritized communal cohesion, local identity, and resistance to outside interference over demanding rational legal accountability for the failures.
It's a defensive embrace of the status quo.
Against perceived cultural and political enemies, yes. It's the institutional equivalent of choosing the comfort of the familiar over the painful upheaval of change.
But that choice creates an incredibly complex and heartbreaking situation for the dissenter. I mean, think about a parent like Kimberly Monterrubio. Her child was a victim. She sees her neighbors actively vote for the officials who failed them.
Yeah.
She is surrounded by a community that has chosen identity preservation over her pursuit of justice.
That dissenter faces a profound, excruciating sense of isolation and internal conflict. The source material highlights that the shooting brought pre-existing community divisions to light racial, socioeconomic, tactical immediacy that hinder long-term healing.
And the communal choice to circle the wagons just makes it worse.
It does. It requires sacrificing the pursuit of accountability for the sake of communal peace, or forcing a premature move past the trauma. For the dissenter, the psychological defense mechanism used by their neighbors, it creates new, deeper fault lines.
It must compound the trauma. You're suffering not just from the loss, but from the betrayal of your own neighbors.
It does. The source notes that a lack of unity in the aftermath of a mass shooting worsens mental health outcomes and actively hinders the coordination of crucial support services. The dissenter, in seeking truth, is now perceived as the one breaking the peace, the one allowing the outsiders in.
So they're forced to live with the knowledge that the collective integrity of their group is being maintained at the direct expense of their individual truth and their child's justice.
And the irony is that for the community to truly heal, it has to address those fault lines and the actual failures. But the protective posture of identity protective cognition actively prevents that necessary introspection, trapping the community in a cycle of isolation and denial.
We've covered extreme historical examples, from murder and treason to administrative betrayal and now communal denial. It paints a picture of institutions and communities constantly failing to live up to their own ideals when they're under extreme pressure.
We have tracked a core painful pattern today. The structures built on these ideal moral codes, whether it's flying to a brother's relief or providing immediate public safety, they often collapse or corrupt under real-world pressure.
And that collapse seems to be rooted in the attempt to preserve the group's internal identity, even at the expense of truth.
From the Morgan affair, where the internal mechanism of the craft became a tool of concealment, to the LEO commentary, where silence became that untempered mortar, to Uvalde, where the community used psychological defense mechanisms against external scrutiny, we just see the profound difficulty in maintaining integrity.
The source text can be harsh on institutional walls, that blue wall kind of behavior. But Uvalde reveals a tragic, sobering reality. We do not live in an ideal world where failure automatically leads to rational accountability.
We don't. In moments of crisis, social identity and psychological self-preservation often override clear, legal, and rational demands for justice. Things just are not black and white.
And that leads us back to the inherent human element we discussed earlier, the universal fallibility that Pike warned us about. We saw Leos expressing that moral dissonance, fearing a system where they won't hang you for a mistake. The system itself, designed to enforce order, generates moral injury.
This is the crux of the gray area. We recognize the necessity of accountability, yet we have to deal with human imperfection. If we maintain an impossibly hypercritical, unforgiving standard, we create a climate that's unsustainable for everyone.
If we demand perfect, unflinching accountability for every failure, without any context for human stress or political pressure or trauma, what's the consequence?
We return to Pike's philosophical requirement. We have to temper our judgment. We have to remember that the laws of our institutions cannot wholly change men's natures.
So the concept of forgiveness or charity, it becomes a form of self-preservation.
It's intrinsically tied to it. If we maintain that utterly unforgiving standard, relentlessly focused only on the moment of failure, we'll eventually find ourselves all alone. We would be cutting ourselves off from the fundamental reality of human imperfection, demanding an ideal that simply doesn't exist.
Because the ultimate aspiration isn't to achieve some impossible, rigid perfection in a flawed system. It's to cultivate the best in those around us, despite the flaws.
That is the highest form of cultural practice and institutional maintenance. It's finding those latent traits of power and sublime devotion, and actively working to revive those faded impressions of generosity and self-sacrifice within ourselves and in others. It's an ongoing project of humanizing the institutions that are constantly at risk of corruption and decay.
Always leaning toward the moral correction that reduces stress rather than the moral silence that becomes the untempered mortar.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. Let's return to the concept of res in bello, the just conduct during an engagement. We discussed how it applies to law enforcement. But what happens when you find yourself operating within a system that requires silence, concealment, or complicity to survive professionally?
When the institutional structures themselves become the primary source of moral injury.
Yes. How do you uphold jus in bello for your own soul? When the system you swore loyalty to attempts to become a noose for the truth, how do you find the boundaries of duty that protect your conscience while still allowing you to function within the collective?
That is the crucial question that every person navigating these complex institutional demands, from ancient oaths to modern crises, must ask and answer for themselves. Thank you for sharing your sources with us and engaging in this deep dive into loyalty, silence, and the challenging architecture of accountability. We encourage you to continue this conversation internally.